Picture this. I'm sitting at my kitchen table in my modest 650 square foot apartment in downtown Phoenix, sipping my morning coffee and reviewing a stack of legal documents that would change my family dynamics forever. The eviction notice on top of the pile had my brother's name printed in bold letters, Michael Thompson, Tenant. The address, 2847 Cascade Hills Drive, that gorgeous $2.3 million mansion he'd been bragging about owning for the past 3 years at every single family gathering. Just 2 weeks ago at our cousin Rebecca's baby shower, Michael had cornered me by the gift table with his usual smirk and said, "Emma, seriously, when are you going to stop throwing money away on that shoebox apartment? At some point, you need to grow up and invest in real property like adults do." He gestured broadly at Rebecca's beautiful suburban home and added, "I mean, look at what homeownership can accomplish. My place in Cascade Hills has already appreciated by $400,000 since I bought it. Meanwhile, you're just making your landlord rich." What Michael didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that the woman he'd been calling financially irresponsible for years was actually sitting on a real estate empire worth $47 million. The sister he pitied for never being able to afford anything decent owned 73 rental properties across 4 states, including that very mansion he called home. The apartment-dwelling failure of the Thompson family was about to hand her successful real estate mogul brother 30 days' notice to vacate the property he thought he owned. My name is Emma Thompson, and what you're about to hear is the true story of how my brother's condescending attitude about my lifestyle choices led to the most satisfying landlord-tenant conversation in real estate history. This isn't just about money or property or family drama. This is about what happens when someone spends years underestimating a woman who's been quietly building an empire while they were busy talking about building equity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight streaming through my apartment windows illuminated the eviction papers spread across my small dining table, and I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Here I was, the family disappointment who couldn't even afford a proper house, about to serve legal notice to the golden child who thought he understood real estate because he lived in a mansion. Michael had no idea that every monthly payment he made, every proud photo he posted on social media, every family gathering where he gave tours of his home theater and wine cellar, was actually just him being an unknowing tenant in my investment portfolio. The text message that had arrived the night before was still glowing on my phone screen. "Hope you can make it to the family barbecue this Sunday, Em. Try not to feel too awkward about the lifestyle difference. We're all rooting for you to figure things out eventually." The message was classic Michael, condescending wrapped in fake concern, delivered with that particular brand of sibling superiority that had defined our relationship since childhood. What made it absolutely perfect was that he'd sent it while standing in the kitchen of a house I owned, using appliances I'd personally selected during the renovation, probably leaning against the granite countertop I'd had installed specifically to attract high-end tenants like him. I picked up my coffee mug, the same basic ceramic cup I'd been using for 5 years, and took a slow sip while reviewing the legal documents my property management company had prepared. Everything was in order. The lease violation notice citing unpaid late fees from a missed payment processing error 2 months ago. The formal demand for possession based on breach of contract terms. The 30-day notice to quit the premise, all perfectly legal, thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating to someone who'd built his entire identity around living in Cascade Hills. Emma Thompson, the woman my family whispered about at holiday dinners when they thought I couldn't hear. Poor Emma, still stuck in that tiny place downtown. She's just never figured out how to get ahead financially like Michael had. They had no idea that their successful son and brother was literally paying my mortgage every month, or that the rent check he wrote with such pride was funding my acquisition of properties in 3 additional states. While Michael was focused on owning one impressive house to live in, I'd been focused on owning dozens of houses for other people to live in. The beautiful thing about real estate investment is that it's almost invisible when done correctly. While Michael was posting Instagram stories about his home gym and infinity pool, documenting every expensive upgrade and luxury feature for his followers to admire. I was quietly closing on duplexes in emerging neighborhoods, small apartment buildings with solid cash flow, and luxury homes in corporate relocation markets. While he was measuring success by square footage and property values, I was measuring success by monthly rental income and portfolio diversification. My phone buzzed with another message. This time from my property manager, Emma. The tenant at Cascade Hills has requested a meeting to discuss lease terms and potential purchase options. Should we schedule with you directly or handle through standard channel? I typed back quickly, schedule directly with me for Thursday at 2 p.m. I'll handle this one personally. The time had come for Michael to meet his landlord face to face, and I wanted to be there to see his reaction when he realized that the sister he'd been patronizing about financial responsibility was actually the business owner who controlled his housing situation. For 3 full years, Michael had been living in my property, paying me premium rent, maintaining my investment immaculately, and using his tenancy as evidence of his superior financial planning compared to his apartment-dwelling sister. 3 years of family gatherings where he'd explain real estate appreciation to relatives while standing in my living room. 3 years of lectures about building equity and creating generational wealth, delivered from the deck of a house that was generating positive cash flow for my retirement portfolio. 3 years of watching him play the role of successful homeowner while I played the role of financial disappointment, all while knowing that our actual positions were completely reversed. The eviction papers weren't really about eviction. Of course, Michael had been an excellent tenant, payments always on time, property maintained beautifully, no complaints from neighbors in the exclusive gated community. The late fee issue was a genuine processing error that could be resolved with a simple phone call. But Michael had specifically requested a meeting to discuss adjusting lease terms based on his excellent tenant history and potential for long-term occupancy, and I knew exactly what that meant. He wanted to negotiate better rental rates or more favorable purchase options, based on the assumption that his landlord would value keeping a responsible tenant like him happy. What Michael didn't understand was that his landlord was his sister, and his sister had been keeping detailed mental notes about every condescending comment, every family gathering lecture about responsible financial planning, and every piece of advice he'd given her about finally growing up and buying real property. The meeting he'd requested would give me the perfect opportunity to reveal not just that I owned his house, but that I'd built the kind of real estate empire he could only dream about while he was focused on living in just one impressive property. I gathered the legal documents into a neat stack and slid them into a manila folder labeled 284-7 Cascade Hills Drive, Thompson. Tomorrow I would drive to my downtown office at Thompson Property Group, the real estate investment company I'd built from nothing while my family thought I was struggling to make rent in a tiny apartment. I would sit across from my brother in my conference room, surrounded by awards for real estate excellence and photographs of the dozens of properties in my portfolio, and watch him realize that everything he thought he knew about our relative success was completely wrong. The woman he'd spent years trying to educate about real estate investment had been his teacher all along. The sister he felt sorry for because she couldn't afford to buy anything decent had been his landlord for 3 years. The family failure who lived in a modest apartment by choice was about to hand the family's success story an eviction notice for the mansion he thought proved his financial superiority. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where you don't have to say a word, you just let reality speak for itself. My apartment might be small, but the view from my kitchen window included a perfect line of sight to the downtown high-rise where Thompson Property Group occupied the entire 15th floor. Every morning I could look out at the headquarters of the real estate empire I'd built while my family worried about my finances, and every morning I was reminded that the most powerful position isn't always the most visible one. Sometimes the best strategy is to let everyone else focus on appearances while you focus on building something real. Thursday afternoon couldn't come fast enough. After years of playing the role of the struggling younger sister, I was finally going to reveal what I'd really been doing with my life. And Michael, the brother who thought he understood real estate because he lived in an expensive house, was about to get a masterclass in the difference between owning property and actually building wealth through property investment. The student was about to meet his teacher, and the tenant was about to meet his landlord, and I had a feeling it was going to be the most interesting family conversation we'd ever had. Growing up as Emma Thompson in the heart of Phoenix meant navigating a family that measured success in square footage and property values. My parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, had built their lives around the traditional American dream of homeownership, but they'd done it the hard way. Dad worked construction for 30 years before saving enough to buy his first house at age 42. And Mom had spent 2 decades as a bank teller watching other people's mortgage applications get approved while ours got delayed again and again. When they finally bought their modest 3-bedroom ranch in Glendale, it became the symbol of everything they believed about financial stability and respectability. Michael absorbed these lessons completely, but he absorbed them with the confidence of someone who'd never had to struggle for anything. Born 18 months before me, he grew up watching our parents celebrate every mortgage payment, every home improvement project, every small increase in property value as evidence that they were building something meaningful. By the time Michael was in high school, he could recite property tax rates for different Phoenix neighborhoods and had memorized the appreciation rates for various zip codes over the past decade. Our parents treated his interest in real estate like a sign of natural business acumen, the kind of inherited wisdom that would ensure he'd never struggle the way they had. I was different from the beginning, and everyone in the Thompson family knew. While Michael was asking Dad to drive him through expensive neighborhoods so he could imagine living there someday, I was asking Mom why some houses sold for more than others, and what made certain locations more valuable. While Michael was focused on the lifestyle that came with owning beautiful homes, I was curious about the mechanics of real estate markets, the factors that drove appreciation, and the relationship between location, timing, and investment return. Our parents interpreted Michael's interest as ambition, and my interest as academic curiosity, the kind of overthinking that kept people stuck in analysis instead of action. The family narrative crystallized when we were teenagers and Dad started taking us to open houses on Sunday afternoon. Michael would walk through expensive homes and talk about which rooms he'd use for what purposes, how he'd decorate the spaces, and which features he'd want to upgrade eventually. He'd stand in master bedrooms and envision his future success, calculating how long it would take him to afford mortgage payments on houses in different price ranges. Our parents would nod approvingly and make comments about Michael having real vision for his future lifestyle. I approached those same open houses completely differently. Instead of imagining myself living in the properties, I found myself analyzing why certain houses had been on the market for months while others sold immediately. I noticed patterns in pricing strategies, staging techniques, and neighborhood characteristics that seemed to predict which properties would appreciate fast. While Michael was focused on finding his dream home, I was unconsciously developing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. An understanding of what made real estate profitable as an investment rather than just a place to live. The difference in our approaches became a source of family commentary that would persist for years. Michael's interest in real estate was seen as practical and mature, evidence that he understood the importance of building equity and establishing himself in desirable communities. My analytical approach was viewed as overthinking, the kind of academic exercise that might be interesting but wasn't directly relevant to the real business of building wealth through homeownership. When Michael announced during his senior year of high school that he planned to major in business with a focus on real estate development, our parents were thrilled. When I mentioned that I was interested in studying finance and economics, they encouraged me to keep it practical and remember that real estate was ultimately about families and homes, not just numbers and market analysis. College amplified these family dynamics in ways that would shape our relationship for years. Michael went to Arizona State University and immediately joined the Real Estate Club, the business fraternity, and every organization that connected him with other students who shared his interest in property development and investment. He spent weekends attending real estate seminars, networking events, and investment workshops, building relationships with local agents, developers, and investors who could help him break into the industry after graduation. Our parents supported these activities enthusiastically, seeing them as evidence that Michael was taking his future seriously and building the professional connections that would ensure his success. I also went to Arizona State, but I approached my education differently. Instead of focusing exclusively on real estate, I studied the broader economic factors that influenced property markets. I took courses in urban planning, demographic analysis, and financial modeling that helped me understand how real estate values were influenced by employment patterns, infrastructure development, and population shift. While Michael was learning how to sell houses and develop properties, I was learning how to predict which areas would experience growth and which investment strategies would generate the best long-term return. The family interpreted our different approaches through the lens of their own values and experiences. Michael's networking and industry involvement looked like the kind of practical career building that would lead to immediate success and financial stability. My academic focus seemed more abstract, the kind of theoretical knowledge that might be interesting but wouldn't necessarily translate into the concrete achievements that mattered in the real world. When Michael landed a summer internship with a local real estate development company, our parents celebrated it as proof that he was on the right track. When I spent my summers working as a research assistant for an economics professor who was studying Phoenix's urban development patterns, they were supportive but clearly saw it as less relevant to building a real estate career. The gap between perception and reality began during our junior year of college, when I started applying the theoretical knowledge I'd been developing to actual market analysis. Professor Williams, who ran the urban economics program, had been tracking demographic and employment data for Phoenix and its surrounding suburbs, and his research had identified several areas that were positioned for significant growth over the next 5 to 10 years. These weren't the established neighborhoods that most real estate professionals were focused on. They were areas that looked unremarkable at the moment, but were about to benefit from infrastructure investments, job growth, and demographic shifts that would transform them into highly desirable locations. I started spending my free time driving through these neighborhoods, analyzing property values, rental rates, and development patterns. What I discovered was that there were opportunities everywhere for someone who understood the data and was willing to look beyond the obvious. While most investors were competing for properties in areas that were already expensive and well established, there were dozens of neighborhoods where you could buy properties at reasonable prices and hold them until the market caught up to their potential. The key was understanding the timing and having the patience to wait for the fundamentals to drive appreciation. Michael's approach to real estate was completely different, and our family saw his approach as more sophisticated and business-oriented. He was focused on learning how to identify properties that were already valuable and figure out ways to develop or improve them to increase their value immediately. His internship involved working on commercial development projects in established business districts, learning how to navigate zoning requirements and construction processes, and building relationships with contractors, architects, and local government officials who could help move projects through the approval process. It was impressive, practical work that had clear connections to building a successful career in real estate development. Our parents were so proud of Michael's professional development that they started introducing him to their friends as their son who was going to be a real estate developer. At family gatherings, Michael would update relatives on his latest projects, explain the development process for commercial properties, and share insights about Phoenix's growth patterns and investment opportunity. He had the vocabulary, the industry connections, and the kind of confident expertise that made him sound like someone who really understood how to succeed in real estate. I listened to these conversations with growing fascination, not because I was impressed by Michael's knowledge, but because I was starting to understand how much he didn't know about the opportunities he was missing. His focus on development and commercial real estate meant he was looking at markets that required significant capital investment and complex regulatory approval processes. Meanwhile, the residential investment opportunities I'd been researching could be accessed with much smaller amounts of capital and offered more immediate cash flow potential. Michael was learning how to build buildings, but I was learning how to build wealth. The first time I mentioned my interest in residential real estate investment at a family dinner, the response was politely dismissive. Michael explained that residential real estate was fine for getting started, but that commercial development was where the real money was made. Our parents nodded along and suggested that I might want to consider working for a company like Michael's internship sponsor, where I could learn about the business from people who were already successful. The implication was clear. Michael had found the right path to real estate success, and I was still figuring out how to follow in his footsteps. What none of them understood was that I wasn't trying to follow Michael's path. I was developing a completely different approach to real estate that would eventually make his development focus look small and limited by comparison. While he was learning how to build individual properties, I was learning how to build portfolios. While he was focused on creating value through construction and development, I was focused on creating value through market timing and strategic acquisition. While he was thinking about real estate as a career, I was thinking about real estate as a wealth-building system that could generate passive income for decades. By senior year, the foundation for our future dynamic was completely established. Michael was the family real estate expert, the son who'd figured out how to turn his interest in property into a promising career path. I was the daughter who was interested in real estate too, but in a more academic way that seemed less directly connected to building the kind of success that our parents respected and understood. Michael was heading toward a career where he'd work for other people's real estate companies and earn commissions on projects he helped develop. I was heading toward something that none of them could have imagined, a real estate investment strategy that would eventually put me in control of more property than any of them could have dreamed of owning. The irony was that our parents' emphasis on traditional homeownership and Michael's focus on impressive development projects had blinded them all to the real opportunity that was sitting right in front of them. While they were focused on owning beautiful homes and building impressive buildings, I was preparing to own dozens of properties that would generate income whether I lived in them or not. While they were thinking about real estate as a lifestyle and a career, I was thinking about real estate as a business that could fund any lifestyle I chose to live. The condescension started subtly during family gatherings in my senior year of college, but it intensified dramatically after Michael graduated and landed his first job with Phoenix Premier Development. Suddenly, every conversation about real estate became an opportunity for my brother to demonstrate his superior understanding of property markets, investment strategies, and wealth building through homeownership. Our parents, who had always been proud of both their children, began treating Michael's opinions about real estate as authoritative while treating my interest in property investment as a nice hobby that might someday help me understand what Michael was teaching us. The pattern became unmistakable at our cousin Jennifer's graduation party, where Michael spent 20 minutes explaining to assembled relatives why location was the most important factor in real estate investment. He used examples from his work with commercial development projects, referenced market data he'd learned from his company's research department, and spoke with the kind of confident authority that made everyone nod along appreciative. When someone asked what I thought about Michael's analysis, I mentioned that residential rental properties in emerging neighborhoods could often provide better cash flow returns than commercial properties in established areas, especially for investors who didn't have access to development capital. Michael's response was swift and condescending in a way that set the tone for years of similar interactions. He smiled indulgently and explained to the group that residential rental properties were fine for people who want to be landlords, but that serious real estate investment required understanding commercial markets, development processes, and the kind of large-scale projects that actually moved market value. He made it sound like my interest in residential investment was sweet, but naive, the kind of small-scale thinking that might work for someone who didn't understand how real wealth was created through real estate. Our parents' reaction to this exchange was even more telling than Michael. Instead of asking follow-up questions about my perspective or encouraging a discussion about different investment approaches, they treated Michael's explanation as educational and moved the conversation toward other topics. The implicit message was clear: Michael was the family expert on real estate, and my contributions to discussions about property investment were interesting but not particularly informed or relevant to serious wealth-building strategy. This dynamic accelerated when Michael bought his first house 6 months after graduation, with help from our parents for the down payment and a mortgage pre-approval based on his new job with Phoenix Premier Development. He purchased a 3-bedroom townhouse in Scottsdale for The house was beautiful, professionally staged, and located in a neighborhood that had experienced steady appreciation over the previous 5 years. Michael's purchase was celebrated by our entire extended family as evidence that he was successfully implementing everything he'd learned about real estate investment and building equity through homeownership. The housewarming party Michael threw 3 weeks after closing became a template for family gatherings that would repeat for years. He gave tours of every room, explaining the features that had made the property a smart investment, the upgraded kitchen appliances that added value, the master bathroom renovation that appealed to future buyers, the location within walking distance of shopping and restaurants that ensured strong resale potential. He showed relatives the comparable sales data he'd used to determine his offer price and explained how his mortgage payments were building equity that would appreciate over time. I attended that housewarming party and listened to Michael's explanations with growing fascination. Not because I was impressed by his investment strategy, but because I was realizing how fundamentally different our approaches to real estate had become. Michael had bought an expensive house in an established neighborhood that would appreciate slowly over time while requiring significant monthly payments for mortgage, insurance, property taxes, and maintenance. His investment strategy was entirely dependent on his ability to make those payments from his job income, and his return on investment would only be realized when he eventually sold the property. Meanwhile, I had spent the previous 6 months researching rental properties in neighborhoods that were positioned for rapid appreciation due to infrastructure development and demographic shift. I had identified properties that could be purchased for $180,000 to $20,000 in areas where rental demand was strong enough to generate immediate positive cash flow. Instead of buying one expensive house that required my income to support its carrying costs, I was preparing to buy multiple less expensive properties that would support themselves through rental income while appreciating in value. When relatives asked what I thought of Michael's new house, I said it was beautiful and congratulated him on finding such a nice property. When they asked whether I was planning to buy a house soon, I explained that I was still researching different neighborhoods and investment options. Michael jumped into these conversations to offer advice about the home buying process, suggesting that I might want to start with something smaller and less expensive until I could afford to move up to neighborhoods like his. He recommended that I talk to his real estate agent and mortgage broker, who could help me understand what price range would be realistic for someone in my financial situation. The assumption underlying Michael's advice was that we were competing in the same market for the same type of property, and that his success in buying an expensive house in an established neighborhood represented a more sophisticated approach to real estate investment than whatever I was considering. He genuinely believed he was helping me by sharing his expertise and encouraging me to follow the same path he'd taken, just at a smaller scale appropriate to my limited financial resources and experience. What Michael didn't understand was that I wasn't trying to follow his path at all. I wasn't interested in buying an expensive house that would require most of my income to support. I wasn't focused on living in established neighborhoods that had already experienced their major appreciation. I wasn't thinking about real estate as a way to demonstrate financial success through homeownership. I was thinking about real estate as a business that could generate income and build wealth through strategic acquisition and professional management of rental properties. The gap between our approaches became more apparent at family dinners over the following months, where Michael would update everyone on his home improvement projects, property value appreciation, and neighborhood developments that were affecting his investment. He spoke about real estate with the enthusiasm of someone who had figured out the secret to building wealth, and was eager to share his knowledge with family members who were still learning. Our parents encouraged these discussions and often asked Michael to explain real estate concepts or market trends that they were curious about. I participated in these conversations by asking questions and offering occasional observations, but I was careful not to challenge Michael's expertise directly or suggest that there might be alternative approaches to real estate investment that he wasn't considering. Partly this was because I didn't want to create family conflict over different investment philosophies, but mostly it was because I was beginning to understand that Michael's confidence in his approach was actually an advantage for me. As long as he was focused on competing in markets I wasn't interested in, he wouldn't notice the opportunities I was pursuing. The pattern of family dynamics around real estate became completely established during my first year after college graduation, when I took a job as a financial analyst with a commercial real estate firm downtown. The job paid well and gave me access to market data, property analysis tools, and industry connections that would be invaluable for developing my own investment strategy. But because the company focused on commercial properties and institutional investments, My work didn't obviously overlap with the residential rental investment approach I was pursuing in my personal time. Michael interpreted my job choice as evidence that I was finally taking real estate seriously and learning from professionals who understood large-scale property investment. He offered to introduce me to contacts from his development company, who worked on commercial projects, suggesting that networking with experienced professionals would help me advance my career and learn about investment opportunities I might not discover on my own. Our parents were pleased that both their children were working in real estate and building expertise that would serve them well in building wealth through property investment. What none of them realized was that my job was essentially providing me with a graduate education in real estate analysis, while paying me to develop skills that would directly support my personal investment activity. I was learning how to evaluate property values, analyze cash flow projections, assess market trends, and structure financing for property acquisition. I was developing relationships with real estate agents, mortgage brokers, property managers, and contractors who specialized in residential investment property. I was building the foundation for a real estate investment business, while my family thought I was just starting my career in commercial real estate analysis. The most telling example of how completely my family misunderstood my approach to real estate came during Thanksgiving dinner in my first year after graduation. Michael had just refinanced his townhouse to take advantage of lower interest rates, and he spent considerable time explaining to relatives how refinancing could be used to access equity for future property purchases. He described his long-term plan to use the appreciation in his current house as a down payment for a larger property in a more expensive neighborhood, eventually building a portfolio of increasingly valuable homes that would fund his retirement. When someone asked whether I was planning to buy a house soon, I mentioned that I was still researching different investment approaches and wasn't ready to commit to a specific property or neighborhood. Michael immediately offered to help me understand the benefits of homeownership and suggested that I was probably overthinking the decision. He explained that real estate appreciation was one of the most reliable wealth-building strategies available, and that waiting for perfect market conditions or ideal properties often meant missing opportunities to start building equity. Our father reinforced Michael's advice by sharing stories about how he and our mother had struggled to save for their first house, emphasizing that the most important step was getting started with homeownership, rather than trying to time the market perfectly. The clear implication was that Michael had successfully launched his real estate investment career, while I was still stuck in the analysis phase, overthinking decisions that should be straightforward for someone with my education and income. I thanked them for their advice and agreed that building equity through real estate was important, but I didn't mention that I had already identified 3 properties I was planning to purchase over the next 6 months. I didn't explain that my research had led me to a completely different investment strategy that focused on cash flow generation rather than equity building through homeownership. I didn't reveal that while Michael was planning to use appreciation in one property to buy progressively more expensive houses, I was planning to use rental income from multiple properties to acquire an entire portfolio of cash-flowing assets. The foundation for years of family misunderstanding was completely established during that Thanksgiving conversation. Michael was the successful real estate investor who had figured out how to build wealth through strategic homeownership. I was the analytical but hesitant sister who understood real estate theory but hadn't yet figured out how to apply it to building actual wealth. Michael's approach was practical and proven, while my approach was still theoretical and uncertain. The family narrative about our relative success in real estate investment was exactly backwards from reality, but it was a narrative that would persist and intensify as Michael's lifestyle became more impressive, while my living situation remained modest and unremarkable. While Michael was celebrating his townhouse purchase and our family was treating him as the real estate expert, I was quietly developing an investment strategy that would eventually dwarf anything he could imagine. The plan began forming during my final semester of college, when Professor Williams shared research data that revealed something extraordinary about Phoenix's development patterns. The city's growth wasn't just expanding outward into new suburban development, it was also creating pockets of opportunity in older neighborhoods that were positioned to benefit from infrastructure improvements, demographic shifts, and urban revitalization projects that were already in the planning stages but wouldn't be implemented for several years. The key insight that separated my approach from conventional real estate wisdom was understanding the difference between leading indicators and lagging indicators of neighborhood appreciation. Most investors, including Michael, focused on areas that were already experiencing visible signs of growth: new construction, rising property values, improved retail and restaurant options, and increasing demand from homebuyers. These were lagging indicators that reflected growth that had already begun, which meant that much of the potential appreciation had already been captured by earlier investors. Leading indicators were much more subtle and required deeper analysis of demographic data, employment trends, infrastructure planning, and municipal development priorities. By studying population migration patterns, job growth in specific industries, and public investment in transportation and utilities, it was possible to identify neighborhoods that were 3 to 5 years away from experiencing significant appreciation but were still available at current market prices. The strategy required patience and confidence in long-term trends, but it offered the potential for much higher returns than investing in areas where growth was already obvious. I spent months mapping these opportunities across the Phoenix metropolitan area, using data from multiple sources to identify the most promising locations for residential rental investment. The Arizona Department of Transportation had published long-term planning documents that showed where new light rail lines and major highway improvements would be constructed over the next decade. The City of Phoenix Economic Development Office had identified target areas for business district revitalization and mixed-use development projects. Demographic analysis from the Census Bureau and private research firms revealed which neighborhoods were attracting young professionals, families with children, and other groups that drove rental demand. The neighborhoods that emerged from this analysis were completely different from the areas where Michael and most traditional investors were focused. Instead of expensive suburbs with high property values and established amenities, my target areas were older neighborhoods closer to downtown Phoenix that had good bones, but needed revitalization. These areas had solid housing stock that had been built in the 1960s and 1970s, mature landscaping, and proximity to employment centers, but they hadn't yet benefited from the urban renewal trends that were transforming similar neighborhoods in other cities. More importantly, these neighborhoods had rental markets that were already strong enough to generate immediate positive cash flow for investment property. Unlike Michael's strategy of buying expensive houses that required his personal income to support mortgage payments, my strategy focused on properties that would pay for themselves from day one through rental income. The properties I was targeting could be purchased for $180,000 to $240,000, renovated for after accounting for mortgage payments, insurance, property taxes, and management costs. Each property would generate $200 to $400 in monthly cash flow while appreciating in value as the surrounding neighborhood improved. The beauty of this strategy was that it was scalable in ways that Michael's approach wasn't. He could only afford to own properties that he could personally support with his job income, which limited him to 1 or maybe 2 expensive houses at most. My approach generated income that could be reinvested into acquiring additional properties, creating a compounding effect where each successful acquisition made the next acquisition easier to finance. Within 5 years, I projected that I could own 15 to 20 rental properties that would collectively generate enough monthly income to support any lifestyle I chose while continuing to appreciate in value. But the most important element of my strategy was something that had nothing to do with real estate analysis or market timing. It was the decision to keep the entire operation completely private until it reached a scale that would be impossible for my family to dismiss or misunderstand. I had watched Michael's approach to building his real estate career, and I understood that seeking family approval and recognition for early achievements could actually interfere with long-term success. Michael felt pressure to buy impressive properties that would generate family admiration, even if those properties weren't optimal investments. He spent time explaining his strategies and seeking validation for his decisions, instead of focusing entirely on execution and result. My approach would be different. Instead of seeking recognition for small achievements, I would build something substantial in complete secrecy, and reveal it only when the results spoke for themselves. Instead of trying to educate my family about alternative investment strategies, I would demonstrate those strategies through actual portfolio performance. Instead of competing with Michael for family approval of our respective real estate expertise, I would build something so much larger than his approach that competition would become irrelevant. This decision to maintain secrecy required careful planning around every aspect of my personal and professional life. I couldn't live in expensive houses or drive luxury cars that would raise questions about how I could afford them on my analyst's salary. I couldn't discuss my investment activities at family gatherings or seek advice from relatives who might want to understand my strategy. I couldn't even celebrate major milestones like property acquisitions or rental income achievements, because those celebrations might reveal what I was building before I was ready for family scrutiny. The lifestyle implications of this strategy were significant, but they were also strategically advantageous. By choosing to live modestly while building my investment portfolio, I could reinvest every available dollar into property acquisitions, instead of spending money on personal consumption that wouldn't generate return. By maintaining a low profile about my financial activities, I could avoid the kind of family pressure and unsolicited advice that might interfere with my decision-making process. By focusing entirely on results rather than recognition, I could optimize every investment decision for long-term wealth building, rather than short-term lifestyle enhancement. The first test of this strategy came 6 months after graduation, when I had saved enough money for a down payment on my first rental property. The property was a 3-bedroom ranch house in the Garfield neighborhood, about 4 miles from downtown Phoenix. The area was undergoing gradual revitalization, as young professionals and artists discovered its affordable housing stock, walkable street grid, and proximity to employment center. The house needed cosmetic renovations, but had solid mechanical systems and a layout that would appeal to professional tenants who wanted more space than apartments offered. I purchased the property for $195,000 with a 20% down payment, financed the purchase with a conventional mortgage at market rates, and spent 3 weeks overseeing renovations that included new flooring, updated kitchen appliances, fresh paint throughout, and improved landscaping. The total investment was $37,000, and I had the property rented to a young marketing executive for $1,850 per month within 2 weeks of completing the renovation. After accounting for all carrying costs, the property generated $29 in monthly cash flow while providing tax benefits through depreciation and expense deduction. The acquisition process taught me valuable lessons about working with real estate agents, contractors, property managers, and tenants that would make future purchases more efficient and profitable. More importantly, it validated my analysis about the Garfield neighborhood's potential. Within 6 months of my purchase, 2 other houses on the same street sold for significantly higher prices than I had paid, and rental rates in the area increased by 8% as demand from professional tenants continued to grow. But the most important outcome of that first property purchase was the confirmation that my strategy could work without any involvement or awareness from my family. Michael never knew that I had bought rental property. Our parents had no idea that their daughter had become a landlord while their son was still making mortgage payments on his owner-occupied townhouse. I had successfully demonstrated that it was possible to build real estate wealth through a completely different approach than the homeownership strategy my family understood and respected. Over the following months, I used the cash flow from my first property and continued savings from my job to prepare for additional acquisition. I refined my analysis of target neighborhoods, developed relationships with agents who specialized in investment properties, and created systems for managing the renovation and rental process efficiently. By the end of my first year after graduation, I was ready to purchase my second property, and I had identified specific houses in 3 different neighborhoods that met my criteria for cash flow potential and appreciation prospects. The plan was ambitious but methodical. I would acquire 1 property every 4 to 6 months, focusing on houses that could be renovated quickly and rented immediately to professional tenants. Each successful acquisition would generate cash flow that could be saved toward the down payment for the next property, creating a self-funding expansion strategy that didn't depend on income from my day job. Within 3 years, I projected that I would own 8 to 10 rental properties that would collectively generate enough monthly income to equal my analyst's salary. More importantly, I projected that Michael would still be making mortgage payments on his increasingly expensive houses, while I would be collecting rental income from a portfolio of properties that were appreciating in value without requiring any personal financial support. The gap between our approaches would become so large that family conversations about real estate success would become irrelevant. I wouldn't need to argue with Michael about investment strategies or seek recognition for my expertise. The results would speak for themselves, and when I was ready to reveal what I had built, the conversation would be about scale rather than strategy. The transformation from real estate theory to real estate business required developing practical skills that weren't taught in college finance courses or learned through casual property research. Over my first 2 years of active investing, I systematically built expertise in every aspect of residential rental property management, from initial market analysis through tenant screening, renovation coordination, and long-term portfolio optimization. Each property acquisition became a case study that refined my understanding of what worked, what didn't work, and what could be improved in future investments. The learning curve was steep, but invaluable. My first property in the Garfield neighborhood taught me that renovation timelines were always longer than contractors estimated, that appliance deliveries required more coordination than I had anticipated, and that professional tenants had specific expectations about property condition and management responsiveness that needed to be met consistently. My second property, a 4-bedroom house in the Coronado neighborhood, taught me about the importance of neighborhood school ratings for attracting family tenants, the value of off-street parking in urban areas, and the impact of property management efficiency on tenant retention. By the time I purchased my third property, I had developed systems that made the entire acquisition and preparation process much more efficient and predictable. I had identified contractors who specialized in rental property renovations and could complete projects faster and more cost-effectively than general contractors who primarily worked on owner-occupied homes. I had established relationships with suppliers who could provide quality appliances, flooring, and fixtures at wholesale prices. I had created standardized renovation specifications that optimized properties for tenant appeal while minimizing ongoing maintenance requirements. More importantly, I had learned to think like a business owner rather than a property owner. Instead of focusing on individual houses as separate investments, I was building a portfolio where each property contributed to overall cash flow, risk diversification, and operational efficiency. I developed standardized lease agreements, tenant screening procedures, and maintenance protocols that could be applied consistently across all property. I created financial tracking systems that allowed me to monitor the performance of individual properties and the portfolio as a whole, identifying opportunities for improvement and expansion. The business skills I was developing went far beyond property management. I was learning to analyze market trends, negotiate purchase prices, structure financing, coordinate professional services, and manage cash flow across multiple properties simultaneously. I was building relationships with real estate agents, mortgage brokers, insurance agents, property managers, and contractors who could support expansion into new markets and property types. I was developing the kind of operational expertise that would allow me to scale from individual property ownership to systematic portfolio development. The most valuable skill I developed during this period was the ability to see opportunities that other investors missed. While most rental property investors focused on obvious metrics like purchase price and potential rental income, I learned to evaluate properties based on dozens of factors that affected long-term profitability. I analyzed neighborhood demographic trends, infrastructure development plans, zoning changes, and local economic indicators that would influence property values and rental demand over time. I studied tenant preferences, competing rental properties, and seasonal market patterns that affected pricing and occupancy rates. This comprehensive approach to property analysis allowed me to identify undervalued properties in neighborhoods that were positioned for appreciation but hadn't yet experienced significant price increases. I could recognize houses that needed minimal renovation to command premium rental rates, properties with unique features that would appeal to specific tenant demographics, and locations where my investment would benefit from upcoming infrastructure improvements or commercial development projects. The financial management aspect of building a rental property portfolio required learning skills that weren't intuitive for someone focused on individual property ownership. I had to understand how to optimize cash flow across multiple properties, balance debt service with reserve fund requirements, and structure acquisitions to maximize tax benefits, while maintaining adequate liquidity for unexpected expenses or investment opportunity. I learned to think about return on investment, not just for individual properties, but for the portfolio as a whole, considering how different properties contributed to overall risk management and growth potential. Perhaps most importantly, I was developing the psychological skills necessary to maintain a long-term investment strategy while living a lifestyle that didn't reflect my growing financial success. Each month, my rental properties generated income that I could have used to upgrade my apartment, buy a nicer car, or enjoy the kind of lifestyle improvements that Michael was experiencing as his career advancement allowed him to afford increasingly expensive housing. Instead, I was disciplined about reinvesting every available dollar into additional property acquisitions, understanding that current lifestyle sacrifices would enable much greater financial freedom in the future. This discipline was particularly challenging during family gatherings where Michael would showcase his latest home improvements, or discuss his plans for upgrading to larger and more expensive property. While he was explaining how real estate appreciation was building his equity and enabling his lifestyle improvements, I was quietly calculating how the cash flow from my growing portfolio was accelerating my ability to acquire additional properties without requiring any personal income support. The contrast between our approaches became more apparent to me even as it remained invisible to our family. Michael was using his increasing income to support increasingly expensive lifestyle choices, including larger mortgage payments, higher property taxes, and more expensive maintenance and improvement projects. His real estate strategy was entirely dependent on his continued employment and career advancement, and his equity was locked into properties that he lived in rather than generating income. My strategy was creating financial independence through income generation that was completely separate from my employment. Each additional property in my portfolio reduced my dependence on my job salary and increased my ability to pursue opportunities that weren't motivated by immediate income requirements. I was building toward a future where my investment income would exceed my living expenses, giving me the freedom to make career and lifestyle decisions based on personal interest rather than financial necessity. By the end of my second year of active investing, I owned 5 rental properties across 3 Phoenix neighborhoods, with a combined portfolio value of approximately $1 in monthly cash flow of $1,800 after all expenses. The properties were performing exactly as I had projected, with consistent occupancy, reliable tenants, and appreciation rates that exceeded my conservative estimate. More importantly, the cash flow and appreciation were enabling me to accelerate my acquisition timeline, with enough accumulated resources to purchase additional properties every 3 to 4 months instead of the 6-month intervals I had originally planned. The operational systems I had developed were working efficiently, with professional property management handling day-to-day tenant interactions, while I focused on strategic decisions about portfolio expansion and market analysis. I had established business entities that provided liability protection and tax optimization, created reserve funds that could handle unexpected expenses or maintenance requirements, and developed financing relationships that would support continued growth without requiring personal income documentation that might raise questions about my investment activities. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that the strategy I had developed was not only viable but scalable in ways that traditional homeownership approaches couldn't match. While Michael was limited to owning properties that he could personally afford to support, I was building a business that generated the income to support its own expansion. While his equity was locked into properties that served his personal housing needs, my equity was generating returns that could be reinvested into additional income-producing assets. The moment I decided to transform my small-scale rental property portfolio into a comprehensive real estate investment business came during a conversation with my property manager, Sarah Martinez, about the challenges of scaling individual property management across multiple neighborhoods. Sarah had been managing 3 of my properties for 8 months, and she'd mentioned that several other property owners in similar situations were struggling with the same operational issues: inconsistent contractor relationships, inefficient maintenance coordination, and difficulty maintaining quality standards across geographically dispersed properties. What struck me about Sarah's observations wasn't just the operational challenges she described, but the business opportunity they represent. If I was experiencing these scaling issues with 5 properties,
Other small-scale investors were likely facing the same problems with their portfolio. More importantly, there were probably dozens of potential investors who were interested in rental property ownership, but intimidated by the complexity of managing renovations, tenant screening, and ongoing property maintenance across multiple locations. The solution became clear during a weekend I spent analyzing the Phoenix rental property market from an entirely different perspective. Instead of looking for individual houses to add to my personal portfolio, I started researching the market infrastructure that supported rental property investment. What I discovered was a significant gap between the services available to large-scale commercial property owners and the resources accessible to individual investors who owned between 5 and 20 residential rental property. Large real estate investment trusts and institutional property owners had access to sophisticated management systems, bulk purchasing power for renovations and maintenance, professional tenant screening and lease administration, and comprehensive financial reporting that optimized portfolio performance across hundreds or thousands of units. Individual property owners had access to basic property management services that handled tenant interactions and maintenance requests, but nothing that approached the systematic, business-oriented infrastructure that would allow them to scale their investments efficiently. The opportunity was to create a property management and investment services company that could provide individual investors with the same level of professional infrastructure that large institutional owners enjoy.
Instead of just managing properties for other owners, I could offer a complete system that included market analysis for new acquisitions, renovation management, tenant placement, ongoing property management, and portfolio optimization services that would help clients build and manage rental property portfolios more effectively than they could manage them independently. This business model would serve multiple strategic purposes beyond generating management fee income. It would give me access to detailed market intelligence about rental property performance across different neighborhoods and property types. It would provide opportunities to identify undervalued properties that clients might not want to purchase, but that would be excellent additions to my personal portfolio. It would establish my expertise and credibility in the real estate investment community, creating relationships that could support continued portfolio expansion. Most importantly, it would generate revenue that wasn't dependent on my day job, accelerating my transition from employee to business owner. The decision to launch Thompson Property Solutions required careful planning to ensure that the business development didn't interfere with my continued personal property acquisitions or reveal the scope of my investment activities to family members who might ask uncomfortable questions about how I could afford to start a business while living in a modest downtown apartment. I structured the company as a limited liability corporation that could operate independently of my personal investment activities, with separate financial accounts, business relationships, and operational systems. The initial client base for Thompson Property Solutions came from networking within the real estate investment community, rather than from family or personal connections that might lead to questions about my background or financial resources. I attended real estate investment club meetings, property management conferences, and landlord association events where I could meet potential clients who were already active in rental property ownership, but struggling with operational challenges that my services could address. The response from potential clients was immediately positive, confirming that the market gap I had identified was real and significant. Within 6 weeks of launching Thompson Property Solutions, I had signed management agreements for 12 properties owned by 4 different investors, generating monthly management fee income of $2,400, while providing me with operational scale that made my own property management more efficient and cost-effective. More importantly, the business was generating intelligence about rental property opportunities that individual investors couldn't access. Through my clients' experiences, I was learning about neighborhoods, property types, and market conditions across a much broader geographic area than I could have researched independently. I was building relationships with contractors, suppliers, and service providers who could support larger-scale renovation and maintenance projects. I was developing expertise in tenant screening, lease negotiation, and property marketing that made my own investments more profitable and less risky. The most valuable aspect of Thompson Property Solutions was the credibility it provided for my continued personal property acquisition. Instead of being a young woman making unusually frequent real estate purchases on an analyst's salary, I was a business owner whose property management company was succeeding in a competitive market. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, and sellers began treating me as a serious investor who understood market conditions and could close transactions efficiently and reliably. This credibility enabled me to access better deals and more attractive financing than I had been able to negotiate as an individual investor. Agents started bringing me properties before they were listed publicly, knowing that I could evaluate opportunities quickly and make competitive offers without financing contingencies that might complicate transactions. Mortgage brokers offered portfolio loan products that were designed for investment professionals and provided more favorable terms than conventional investor mortgages. Sellers were willing to consider owner financing and creative deal structures that reduced my capital requirements for property acquisition. Within 6 months of launching Thompson Property Solutions, I had expanded my personal portfolio to 8 properties, while growing the business to manage 23 properties for 7 different clients. The combined cash flow from property management fees and rental income was approaching $4,000 per month, creating sufficient resources to accelerate my property acquisition timeline and begin exploring opportunities in markets outside Phoenix. The business success also provided cover for lifestyle choices that might otherwise have raised questions from family members. When relatives asked about my continued residence in a downtown apartment, I could explain that my property management business required proximity to downtown Phoenix for client meetings and property oversight. When they noticed that I was driving a reliable but modest car instead of upgrading to something more expensive, I could mention that business cash flow was being reinvested into company growth rather than personal consumption. The most significant development during this period was my decision to begin targeting luxury rental properties that could serve corporate relocation clients and international business travelers. Through Thompson Property Solutions, I had learned that Phoenix was experiencing increasing demand from executives who needed furnished, high-end temporary housing while relocating to the area or managing extended business projects. These clients were willing to pay premium rates for properties that provided the amenities and service levels they expected. But the supply of suitable rental properties was limited. This market segment represented an opportunity to generate much higher cash flow per property, while serving tenants who were less likely to cause maintenance issues or payment problems. Luxury rental properties required larger initial investments for acquisition and furnishing, but they could generate monthly rental income of $4,000 to $6,000 compared to the $1,800 to $2,200 that my standard residential properties produce. I identified the Cascade Hills neighborhood as the ideal location for luxury rental property investment. The area featured large, well-built homes with premium amenities, excellent schools, and proximity to major corporate offices that housed the kind of executives who needed temporary housing. Property values in Cascade Hills were high enough to discourage most small-scale investors, but rental demand from corporate clients was strong enough to support the carrying costs and generate attractive returns for investors who could afford the initial capital requirement. The research process for luxury rental investment taught me about market segments I hadn't previously considered. Corporate relocation services, international business consulting firms, and executive search companies all had clients who needed temporary housing that was more comfortable and convenient than extended stay hotels, but more flexible than traditional lease agreements. These clients could justify premium rental rates because the housing costs were typically covered by their employers or were tax-deductible business expenses. I spent 3 months analyzing the Cascade Hills rental market, studying comparable properties, and developing relationships with corporate housing specialists who could provide referrals for qualified tenants. The research confirmed that luxury rental properties in the neighborhood could generate monthly cash flow of $1,500 to $2,500 per property after accounting for higher carrying costs, furnishing expenses, and more intensive property management requirements. The opportunity to purchase my first luxury rental property came through a contact I had developed during my research into the Cascade Hills market. A real estate agent who specialized in high-end properties mentioned that one of her clients was facing foreclosure on a $3 million mansion and was motivated to negotiate a quick sale to avoid the public auction process. The property was exactly what I had been looking for: a 4-bedroom house with premium amenities, professional landscaping, and the kind of executive appeal that would command top rental rates from corporate clients. I arranged to tour the property on a Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by Sarah Martinez and a contractor who could provide preliminary estimates for any renovation work that might be needed. The house was stunning, with marble floors, custom cabinetry, a wine cellar, and an infinity pool that overlooked the golf course. The owner had invested heavily in upgrades and improvements that would appeal to executive tenants, but his business had failed and he could no longer afford the mortgage payments. The negotiation process took 2 weeks, but I was ultimately able to purchase the property for $8 million, significantly below its appraised value of $3 million. The seller was motivated to close quickly and avoid foreclosure, and I was able to offer all-cash purchase that eliminated financing contingencies and closing delay. The acquisition required most of my accumulated resources from property management fees and rental income, but it represented a major step forward in my strategy to build a diversified rental property portfolio. More importantly, the Cascade Hills property would become the centerpiece of a luxury rental program that would generate premium cash flow, while serving as a showcase for the kind of high-end property management services that Thompson Property Solutions could provide. I planned to furnish the house with contemporary executive furniture, establish relationships with corporate housing coordinators, and develop marketing materials that would position the property as the premier temporary housing option for business executives relocating to Phoenix. What I didn't anticipate was that the perfect tenant for my new luxury rental property would turn out to be my own brother, who was searching for a house in Cascade Hills and didn't realize that his sister had just become one of the neighborhood's newest landlords. The irony of Michael becoming my tenant in the Cascade Hills property was too perfect to resist, but it required careful orchestration to ensure that he would never connect his new landlord with his sister who supposedly couldn't afford to buy real estate. I instructed Sarah Martinez to handle all interactions with Michael's real estate agent through Thompson Property Solutions, positioning the rental as a luxury corporate housing option that included potential purchase terms for qualified tenants. Michael's agent presented the opportunity as a chance to test drive life in Cascade Hills while building toward homeownership in the exclusive community. From Michael's perspective, the rental arrangement was ideal because it allowed him to establish himself in Phoenix's most prestigious neighborhood, without committing to a purchase until he was certain about the location and the specific property. The monthly rent of $8,500 was substantial, but it was positioned as rent credit toward eventual purchase, making Michael feel like he was making a strategic financial decision rather than just paying expensive rent. He signed a 3-year lease with automatic renewal options and purchase terms that seemed generous, but were actually structured to be nearly impossible to execute. The lease agreement was crafted to give Michael the psychological satisfaction of believing he was on a path toward homeownership while ensuring that I maintained control of the property and could terminate his tenancy if necessary. The purchase option required specific financial qualifications that would be difficult for Michael to meet even with his increasing income from Phoenix Premier Development. More importantly, the purchase price was structured to adjust with market appreciation, meaning that the longer Michael waited to exercise the option, the more expensive the house would become. While Michael was moving into what he believed was his stepping stone to luxury homeownership, I was using the cash flow from his rent payments to accelerate my acquisition of additional properties across multiple market segments. The $8,500 monthly payment from the Cascade Hills property, combined with income from my other rental properties and Thompson Property Solutions management fees, was generating sufficient cash flow to purchase new properties every 2 to 3 months instead of the 6-month intervals I had originally planned. The business momentum was accelerating in ways that exceeded my most optimistic projection. Thompson Property Solutions had grown to manage 37 properties for 12 different clients, generating monthly management fee income of $7,200, while providing operational efficiencies that reduced the costs of managing my personal portfolio. The combination of management fees and rental income from my own properties was producing monthly cash flow of $11,800, creating resources for continued expansion that were completely independent of my analyst's salary. More importantly, the business was generating referrals and opportunities that I couldn't have accessed as an individual investor. Clients were bringing me potential deals, asking for advice about property acquisitions, and recommending Thompson Property Solutions to other investors who needed professional management services. The company was developing a reputation in the Phoenix real estate investment community as a sophisticated operation that could handle complex property management challenges and help clients optimize their portfolio performance. The success of Thompson Property Solutions also provided perfect cover for my increasingly frequent property purchases and my growing expertise in real estate investment. When family members occasionally asked about my work or my plans for buying a house, I could explain that my property management business was keeping me busy and teaching me about different neighborhoods and investment strategy. I could mention that I was learning a lot about real estate through my clients' experiences, which explained my knowledge of market trends and property values, without revealing the scope of my personal investment activity. The contrast between my public persona and my actual financial situation became more pronounced during family gatherings at Michael's house in Cascade Hills. He would give tours of the property explaining the features that made it such a smart investment, and discussing his plans for eventually purchasing the house when his lease terms allowed. Our parents would express pride in Michael's success and comment on how impressive it was that he could afford to live in such an exclusive neighborhood. Meanwhile, I would sit quietly in the living room I had personally furnished, drinking wine from glasses I had selected, admiring the view from windows I had chosen, knowing that every dollar Michael spent on rent was funding my acquisition of additional property. The psychological dynamics of these family gatherings were fascinating and occasionally surreal. Michael would explain real estate investment concepts to relatives while standing in my house, describe neighborhood appreciation trends while walking through my backyard, and offer advice about building wealth through property ownership while writing monthly rent checks that supported my business expansion. Our parents would nod approvingly at Michael's expertise and suggest that I should learn from his example about the importance of real estate investment. I participated in these conversations by asking thoughtful questions and expressing admiration for Michael's success, while privately calculating how his rent payments were contributing to my ability to purchase additional properties in markets he'd never considered. When Michael mentioned that his house had appreciated in value since he'd moved in, I knew exactly how much it had appreciated because I received monthly property valuation updates from my real estate agent. When he discussed his plans for eventually buying the property, I knew exactly what financial requirements he would need to meet and how unlikely it was that he would qualify for the purchase term. The most satisfying aspect of this arrangement was watching Michael develop genuine expertise in real estate market analysis and property evaluation, expertise that he was gaining by living in one of my investment properties. He became knowledgeable about Cascade Hills property values, neighborhood amenities, and market trends that affected luxury home ownership. He could speak intelligently about property taxes, homeowners association fees, and maintenance costs for high-end property. He developed opinions about which areas of Phoenix offered the best investment potential, and what features were most important for property appreciation. All of this knowledge was accurate and valuable, but it was knowledge that Michael was gaining as a tenant in my portfolio, rather than as an independent property owner. His expertise was based on living in a house that I had purchased, renovated, and furnished specifically to attract tenants like him. His understanding of luxury real estate markets was being subsidized by rent payments that were funding my expansion into additional luxury rental properties in Scottsdale, Tempe, and Paradise Valley. During this period, I was also expanding Thompson Property Solutions into property acquisition and development services that would position the company as a full-service real estate investment firm rather than just a property management operation. I began offering clients assistance with identifying potential purchases, coordinating due diligence and inspections, managing renovation projects, and structuring financing for portfolio expansion. These services generated additional fee income while giving me access to deal flow and market intelligence that supported my personal investment strategy. The expansion of services required hiring additional staff and establishing more sophisticated business systems, but the growth was entirely funded by cash flow from existing operations rather than external investment or debt finance. I hired 2 additional property managers, a renovation coordinator and an administrative assistant, who could handle the increasing volume of client communications and transaction coordination. I leased office space in a downtown Phoenix building that provided professional meeting facilities and project management capabilities that clients expected from a serious real estate services firm. By the end of Michael's first year as my tenant, Thompson Property Solutions was managing 62 properties for 18 clients, while I personally owned 12 rental properties across 4 different Phoenix area markets. The combined monthly cash flow from all sources was approaching $18,000, creating resources for continued expansion that were limited only by my ability to identify suitable investment opportunities and manage the operational complexity of a rapidly growing portfolio. The business success was also attracting attention from other real estate investment professionals who were interested in partnership opportunities, joint ventures, and strategic relationships that could accelerate growth beyond what I could achieve independently. Commercial real estate brokers were bringing me larger deal opportunities that required more capital than individual investors could access. Mortgage brokers were offering portfolio financing products that could support acquisition of multiple properties simultaneously. Other property management companies were proposing merger or acquisition discussions that could combine operations and create larger market presence. These opportunities represented potential paths for scaling Thompson Property Solutions into a major regional real estate investment firm, but they also posed risks to the strategic secrecy that had been essential to my success. Partnership arrangements would require financial disclosure that might reveal the scope of my personal investment activities. Larger transactions would generate public records and industry publicity that might attract family attention to my business activity. Growth beyond a certain scale would make it impossible to maintain the modest lifestyle that allowed me to reinvest all available resources into continued property acquisition. The challenge was to continue building wealth and business success while maintaining operational security that protected my long-term strategy from premature disclosure or interference. I needed to grow Thompson Property Solutions large enough to generate the deal flow and operational efficiencies that would support continued portfolio expansion, but not so large that the business success would raise questions about how I could afford to live modestly while building a sophisticated real estate investment operation. The solution was to focus on selective growth that prioritized profitability and strategic value over visibility and recognition. Instead of pursuing the largest possible client base or the most prestigious properties, I would focus on clients and opportunities that provided the best combination of cash flow generation, market intelligence, and portfolio diversification. Instead of seeking industry recognition or media attention that might attract unwanted scrutiny, I would build reputation through client referrals and professional relationships that were based on results rather than publicity. This approach allowed me to continue expanding my personal portfolio while growing Thompson Property Solutions at a pace that was sustainable and strategically advantageous. More importantly, it positioned me to take advantage of opportunities that would eventually dwarf Michael's real estate investments, while maintaining the element of surprise that would make the eventual revelation of my success as devastating and satisfying as possible. The expansion of my real estate investment strategy into markets beyond Phoenix required developing expertise in geographic areas where I didn't have the local knowledge and professional relationships that had supported my success in Arizona. After 18 months of building Thompson Property Solutions and expanding my personal portfolio to 15 properties, I was generating sufficient cash flow to begin serious investigation of opportunities in Denver, Colorado, where demographic trends and economic development patterns suggested strong potential for rental property investment. Denver's market characteristics were different from Phoenix in ways that required modifying my investment approach. But the fundamental opportunity was similar, identifying neighborhoods that were positioned for appreciation due to infrastructure development, employment growth, and demographic shifts that weren't yet reflected in property value. The city's downtown revitalization, light rail expansion, and attraction of technology companies were creating rental demand from young professionals who wanted urban living options with access to outdoor recreation opportunities. The research process for Denver investment required establishing new professional relationships and learning about local market conditions that affected everything from property taxes and rental regulations to seasonal demand patterns and tenant preferences.
I spent a week in Denver meeting with real estate agents, property managers, and local investors who could provide insights about which neighborhoods offered the best opportunities for out-of-state investors. The trip was positioned as business development for Thompson Property Solutions, which provided legitimate cover for the market research while establishing credentials as a serious real estate investment professional. What I discovered during that research trip was that Denver's rental property market had several characteristics that made it extremely attractive for the kind of strategic investment approach I had developed in Phoenix. The city's rapid job growth was creating demand for rental housing that exceeded the supply of quality properties in desirable neighborhoods. Many local investors were focused on either luxury properties that required significant capital or lower-end properties that generated modest returns, leaving opportunities in the middle market segment that could provide strong cash flow with reasonable appreciation potential. More importantly, Denver's market had not yet attracted the kind of institutional investment attention that was beginning to affect property availability and pricing in Phoenix. Individual investors could still acquire properties at reasonable prices in neighborhoods that were positioned for significant appreciation over the next 3 to 5 years. The opportunity existed to establish a meaningful portfolio presence before larger investors discovered the same market dynamics that I had identified. The first Denver property I purchased was a 3-bedroom bungalow in the Berkeley neighborhood, an area that was experiencing gradual gentrification as young professionals discovered its affordable housing stock, walkable commercial district, and proximity to downtown employment center. The property required minimal renovation and could be rented immediately to professional tenants for $2,400 per month, generating positive cash flow after all expenses, while providing exposure to a market that had strong appreciation potential. The success of that initial Denver investment validated my analysis of the market opportunity and provided operational experience that would support additional acquisitions in the area. Within 6 months, I had purchased 3 properties in Denver neighborhoods, established relationships with local property management and renovation contractors, and developed systems for managing out-of-state investments that didn't require constant personal oversight. The Denver expansion also provided strategic diversification that reduced my portfolio's dependence on Phoenix market conditions while generating cash flow from a second geographic market. More importantly, it demonstrated that the investment approach I had developed was scalable to other markets with similar demographic and economic characteristics. The success in Denver positioned me to consider expansion into additional metropolitan areas that offered comparable opportunities for rental property investment. While I was building a multi-state rental property portfolio, Michael was encountering the first serious challenges to his real estate strategy. His lease renewal notice for the Cascade Hills property included a rent increase to $9,800 per month, reflecting market appreciation and comparable rental rates in the neighborhood. The increase was substantial but justified by rising property values and increased demand for luxury rental properties in exclusive areas. Michael's reaction to the rent increase revealed the limitations of his approach to real estate investment. Because his housing costs were entirely dependent on his employment income, any increase in those costs created financial pressure that affected his ability to save money for property purchases or other investments. More importantly, the rent increase highlighted the fact that he was subject to market forces beyond his control, rather than benefiting from those same market forces as a property owner. The psychological impact of the rent increase was even more significant than the financial impact. For the first time since moving to Cascade Hills, Michael was being forced to confront the reality that he was a tenant rather than a homeowner. Despite his success in establishing himself in an exclusive neighborhood, the property he had been treating as evidence of his real estate investment success was actually owned by someone else who controlled his housing situation and could adjust his living costs based on market conditions. Michael's response was to research the ownership structure of his rental property for the first time since signing the lease. What he discovered was a complex web of limited liability companies and property management entities that made it difficult to identify the actual property owner. Every public record led to another business entity, and every business entity was registered to professional management companies that specialized in real estate investment services.
The opacity of the ownership structure was intentional, designed to provide privacy protection for investors while maintaining professional management standards that met tenant expectations. But from Michael's perspective, the inability to identify his landlord was frustrating and concerning. He was accustomed to dealing with individuals or clearly identifiable companies, not anonymous investment entities that operated through intermediaries and management companies. Michael's frustration with his housing situation led him to begin seriously evaluating alternatives for the first time since moving to Cascade Hills. He researched comparable rental properties in other upscale neighborhoods, investigated the possibility of purchasing a home in a different area, and calculated the financial requirements for exercising his purchase option on the current property. What he discovered was that all of these alternatives were either more expensive or less desirable than his current situation. The rental market for luxury properties had appreciated significantly during his 3 years of tenancy, making comparable properties in similar neighborhoods even more expensive than his current rent. The purchase market for homes in Cascade Hills and comparable areas had experienced similar appreciation, making homeownership much more expensive than it had been when he first moved to the area. The purchase option in his lease agreement was still available, but the financial requirements had increased with market appreciation and current lending standards. For the first time in his adult life, Michael was experiencing the reality that many renters face, being subject to market forces that can make housing less affordable over time, regardless of career success or income growth. His expertise in real estate markets was sophisticated enough to understand the dynamics that were affecting his housing costs, but his position as a tenant rather than an owner left him with limited options for controlling those costs. The contrast between Michael's situation and my portfolio performance during the same period was becoming dramatic, even though Michael had no awareness of my investment activities. While he was experiencing increased housing costs that created financial pressure and reduced his flexibility, I was benefiting from the same market appreciation that was affecting his rent. The properties in my portfolio were generating increased rental income as market rates rose, while also appreciating in value at rates that exceeded my conservative projections. The Denver properties were performing particularly well, with rental rates increasing faster than my operating costs and property values appreciating at double-digit annual rates. The combination of cash flow growth and appreciation was creating resources for continued expansion at an accelerated pace, while also building equity that could be accessed through refinancing or property sales if needed for larger investment opportunities. More importantly, my position as a property owner rather than a tenant meant that I was benefiting from the same market dynamics that were creating challenges for Michael. Instead of experiencing increased housing costs, I was generating increased rental income. Instead of having my housing situation controlled by anonymous landlords, I was controlling the housing situations of dozens of tenants across multiple markets. Instead of being subject to market forces beyond my control, I was positioned to benefit from market appreciation and rental demand growth. The strategic positioning was working exactly as I had planned. While Michael was building his lifestyle and identity around living in an expensive house that he didn't own, I was building a business that owned dozens of houses that generated income regardless of where I chose to live. While he was becoming more financially vulnerable to market changes and employment uncertainties, I was becoming more financially independent through diversified investment income that wasn't dependent on any single job or career path. The psychological dynamics of our family relationship were also shifting in ways that Michael didn't recognize but that were becoming increasingly obvious to me. His confidence in his real estate expertise was being undermined by his experience as a tenant, who was subject to market forces beyond his control. His advice about real estate investment was based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience as a property owner. His success in building wealth through real estate was actually dependent on his ability to maintain employment income that could support increasingly expensive housing costs. Meanwhile, my actual expertise in real estate investment was growing through daily experience managing multiple properties, analyzing market opportunities, and making acquisition decisions that generated measurable returns. My wealth building through real estate was creating financial independence rather than dependence on employment income. My understanding of market dynamics was based on owning properties that responded to those dynamics rather than just observing them as a tenant or industry professional. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal the complete reversal of our actual positions in the real estate investment world. Michael the expert would discover that he had been a tenant in the portfolio of Michael the novice. The successful real estate investor would learn that his housing situation was controlled by the sister he had been patronizing about financial responsibility. The teacher would meet his landlord, and the landlord would turn out to be the student he thought he had been educating about property ownership and wealth building. The first indication that Michael's perfect world in Cascade Hills was beginning to crack came through a phone call I received from Sarah Martinez on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Michael had contacted Thompson Property Solutions directly, bypassing his usual communication through the property management portal, to request a meeting about potential modifications to his lease term. According to Sarah, Michael had expressed frustration with the recent rent increase and wanted to discuss options for long-term occupancy that might provide more predictable housing costs. What made this development particularly interesting was that Michael was essentially asking to negotiate with his landlord for the first time since moving into the property 3 years earlier. His previous rent payments had been automatic, his maintenance request had been handled through standard property management procedures, and his interactions with Thompson Property Solutions had been minimal and professional. The request for a direct meeting indicated that he was experiencing enough financial pressure from the rent increase to seek alternatives to his current lease arrangement. Sarah's description of Michael's communication tone suggested that he was approaching the situation with the confidence of someone who believed his excellent tenant history and long-term occupancy should give him leverage in lease negotiation. He had emphasized his reliability as a tenant, his meticulous maintenance of the property, and his interest in potentially purchasing the house if suitable financing terms could be arranged. He was positioning himself as the kind of tenant that any landlord would want to retain, expecting that his track record would translate into favorable treatment for lease modifications or purchase options. What Michael didn't understand was that his request for preferential treatment was being evaluated by the same landlord who had listened to years of condescending comments about her financial irresponsibility and inability to understand real estate investment. His appeal for consideration based on his tenant history was being reviewed by the sister he had patronized about the importance of building equity through homeownership. His confidence in his negotiating position was about to collide with the reality that his housing situation was controlled by someone who had very specific reasons for being unimpressed by his appeals for special consideration. I instructed Sarah to schedule the meeting for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. in the Thompson Property Solutions conference room, with me attending as the property owner to discuss potential lease modifications directly. The meeting would be positioned as a standard landlord-tenant consultation about lease renewal options, giving Michael no advance warning that he would be meeting with anyone other than a professional property management representative and the anonymous investor who owned his house. The week between scheduling the meeting and the actual appointment gave me time to prepare for what would be the most satisfying conversation of my entire real estate investment career. I reviewed Michael's complete tenant file, including his payment history, maintenance requests, and all communications with Thompson Property Solutions over the previous 3 years. I analyzed current market conditions for luxury rental properties in Cascade Hills, researched comparable lease renewal terms for similar properties, and calculated the fair market value for his specific house based on recent sales and rental data. More importantly, I prepared psychologically for the moment when Michael would realize that his unsuccessful sister was actually his landlord. I had been building toward this revelation for years, but the reality of it happening was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. This would be the first time anyone in my family discovered the truth about my real estate investment activities, and Michael's reaction would set the tone for how I would eventually reveal my success to our parents and extended family. The most challenging aspect of preparing for the meeting was deciding how much information to reveal and how to structure the conversation to maximize its impact. I could simply reveal my identity as the property owner and watch Michael process the implications, or I could gradually disclose the scope of my real estate investment portfolio to demonstrate how completely his assumptions about our relative success had been wrong. I could focus on the specific property he was renting and his position as my tenant, or I could use the meeting as an opportunity to educate him about the business I had built while he was celebrating his lifestyle achievement. I decided to start with the basic revelation that I owned his house and let Michael's questions and reactions guide how much additional information to share about Thompson Property Solutions and my broader investment portfolio. The meeting was supposed to be about his lease renewal terms, and I wanted to maintain that focus while allowing the personal dynamics to develop naturally, based on his response to discovering his landlord's identity. The psychological preparation also involved thinking carefully about my own motivations and goals for the conversation. While there was obvious satisfaction in revealing that Michael had been wrong about my financial situation, I didn't want the meeting to become purely about family drama rather than legitimate business discussion. Michael was actually an excellent tenant who had maintained the property beautifully and paid his rent reliably, and those facts were relevant to any decisions about lease renewal terms, regardless of our personal relationship. More importantly, I wanted Michael to understand that his situation was the result of his own choices and assumptions, rather than any deliberate deception on my part. He had chosen to rent a house without researching its ownership. He had assumed that his sister couldn't afford real estate investment, based on her living situation and lifestyle choices. He had spent years offering advice about real estate investment to someone who was actually more successful in that area than he was. The revelation would be devastating, but it would be devastating because reality conflicted with his assumptions, not because I had actively misled him about my circumstance. The final element of my preparation was practical, deciding what lease renewal terms to offer Michael regardless of our personal relationship. The rent increase to $9,800 per month was justified by current market conditions and comparable rental rates for similar property. The purchase option terms in his existing lease were structured fairly based on property values and lending standards when the lease was signed. Any modifications to those terms would need to be based on legitimate business considerations, rather than family relationships or personal consideration. I concluded that the most appropriate approach would be to offer Michael the same lease renewal terms that I would offer any tenant with his payment history and property maintenance record. If he wanted to negotiate modifications to those terms, he would need to present legitimate justifications based on market conditions, tenant value, or other factors that any landlord would consider. His status as my brother would not result in preferential treatment, but it also wouldn't result in discriminatory treatment, as long as he continued to be a responsible tenant. The weekend before the meeting, I drove past the Cascade Hills property to see it from Michael's perspective and remind myself of what he would be experiencing during our conversation. The house was beautiful, meticulously maintained, and obviously expensive. From the street, it looked like exactly the kind of property that would impress family members and demonstrate financial success. Michael had every reason to be proud of living there and to use it as evidence of his real estate investment expertise. What Michael couldn't see from his perspective as a tenant was the business infrastructure that supported the property's operation as an investment asset. He didn't know about the market analysis that had identified Cascade Hills as an optimal location for luxury rental investment. He wasn't aware of the renovation planning that had optimized the property for executive tenant appeal. He had no understanding of the financial modeling that had determined appropriate rental rates and lease terms. He was living in a sophisticated real estate investment, but he was experiencing it as a consumer rather than understanding it as a business operation. The contrast between Michael's perspective and my perspective on the same property perfectly illustrated the gap between our approaches to real estate investment. Michael thought about real estate in terms of lifestyle and personal consumption, focusing on the experience of living in impressive properties and the social recognition that came with expensive housing. I thought about real estate in terms of business performance and financial returns, focusing on cash flow generation, market positioning, and portfolio optimization that created long-term wealth-building opportunities. Thursday afternoon couldn't arrive fast enough. After years of playing the role of the financially irresponsible sister who couldn't understand real estate investment, I was finally going to reveal the truth about what I had actually been building while Michael was lecturing me about the importance of homeownership. The student was about to meet her teacher, the tenant was about to meet his landlord, and the family expert on real estate investment, was about to discover that his expertise was entirely theoretical compared to his sister's practical experience as a property owner and business operator. The conversation would change everything about our family dynamics and our respective positions in the real estate investment world. More importantly, it would demonstrate the difference between building a lifestyle around impressive properties and building a business around profitable property. Michael was about to learn that there was a significant difference between living in luxury and owning luxury, and that his sister had been teaching him that lesson for 3 years without his knowledge or understanding. The meeting that would change everything was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m., but the systematic unraveling of Michael's assumptions about his housing situation began 3 days earlier when he received a formal notice from Thompson Property Solutions regarding potential lease violation. The notice wasn't about anything serious, just a technical issue with landscaping maintenance that violated community standards in the Cascade Hills Homeowners Association. But the formal tone of the communication and the threat of additional fees if the issue wasn't resolved within 10 days triggered something in Michael that had been building since the rent increase announcement. For the first time since moving into what he considered his dream home, Michael began researching the actual ownership structure of the property, with the intensity of someone who suspected he was being taken advantage of. What he discovered through public record searches was a maze of corporate entities that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify who actually controlled his living situation. The property was owned by Cascade Holdings LLC, which was managed by Desert Property Management, which was a subsidiary of Thompson Property Solutions, which was registered to an address downtown that he'd never bothered to investigate. The complexity of the ownership structure annoyed Michael in ways that revealed how little he actually understood about professional real estate investment. He was accustomed to thinking about real estate ownership in terms of individual homeowners, or clearly identifiable companies, not sophisticated business structures that provided privacy protection and liability limitation for investors. The fact that he couldn't easily identify his landlord suggested to him that something wasn't quite right about his rental arrangement, when in reality it demonstrated that his landlord was operating at a level of professionalism that he hadn't encountered before. Michael's research into Thompson Property Solutions revealed information that should have impressed him but instead made him more suspicious about his housing situation. The company managed over 80 properties across multiple Arizona markets, had been featured in Phoenix Business Journal as one of the region's fastest-growing property management firms, and specialized in luxury rental properties that served corporate clients and high-net-worth individuals. The website showcased testimonials from satisfied clients, case studies of successful property management projects, and professional credentials that indicated serious expertise in real estate investment services. What bothered Michael about this information wasn't that Thompson Property Solutions appeared to be unprofessional or unreliable. What bothered him was that he was apparently just one tenant among dozens in a large portfolio, rather than being a valued individual client, whose excellent tenant history should give him special consideration for lease negotiation. He had assumed that his landlord would be someone like himself, a successful professional who owned a few properties, and would appreciate working with responsible tenants who maintained properties well and paid rent reliably. The realization that he was dealing with a systematic business operation, rather than an individual property owner, changed Michael's approach to the upcoming meeting about lease renewal terms. Instead of expecting to negotiate based on personal relationships and tenant history, he began preparing for what he recognized would be a business discussion with professional investors who evaluated everything based on market conditions and financial performance. He researched comparable rental rates for luxury properties in Cascade Hills, analyzed his own financial capacity for potential rent increases, and developed arguments for why his long-term tenancy should be valued in lease renewal negotiations. The preparation process forced Michael to confront aspects of his housing situation that he had been avoiding since the rent increase notice arrived. His monthly housing costs had increased by 43% over 3 years, from the original $8,500 to the proposed $9,800, which represented a significant portion of his income, even with the promotions and salary increase.
increases he had received during the same period. More concerning was his realization that he had no control over future rent increases, and that market appreciation in Cascade Hills could make his housing costs unsustainable regardless of his career success. For the first time since moving to Cascade Hills, Michael calculated what it would cost to purchase a comparable property in the neighborhood using conventional financing. The numbers were sobering. Houses similar to his rental property were selling for $2 million, requiring down payments of $560,000 to $640,000, plus closing costs and immediate responsibility for property taxes, insurance and maintenance expenses that were currently covered by his rent payment. His current financial position wouldn't support purchasing anything comparable to what he was renting, meaning that his lifestyle in Cascade Hills was entirely dependent on his ability to continue paying increasingly expensive rent. The psychological impact of this analysis was profound and uncomfortable. Michael had built his identity around being someone who understood real estate investment and was successfully building wealth through property ownership. But his actual situation was that of a high-end renter, whose lifestyle was entirely dependent on employment income, and who had no equity position in the property that represented his primary asset and status symbol. He was living like a wealthy property owner while actually being a tenant, whose housing security was controlled by investors he had never met. The distinction between his self-perception and his actual circumstances became even more apparent when Michael researched the purchase option clause in his lease agreement with the kind of detailed attention he should have applied when originally signing the contract. The purchase terms that had seemed reasonable 3 years earlier were now clearly structured to be difficult if not impossible to execute. The option price was tied to appraised value at the time of exercise, meaning that appreciation during his tenancy would increase the purchase requirement. The financing terms required debt-to-income ratios that would be challenging to meet even with his current salary and career trajectory. Most importantly, the purchase option included balloon payment requirements and portfolio loan qualifications that suggested his landlord expected him to either have significant liquid assets or access to commercial financing that was typically available only to experienced real estate investors. The terms weren't designed for someone like Michael, who had employment income and career prospects but limited investment capital. They were designed for investors who could structure creative financing or had sufficient resources to close quickly without conventional mortgage contingency. The realization that his purchase option was essentially meaningless forced Michael to accept that his tenancy in Cascade Hills was exactly that, tenancy without any realistic path to ownership. The lease agreement he had signed with such optimism 3 years earlier was a sophisticated rent contract that provided excellent housing, but no real opportunity for building equity or achieving the homeownership that he had used to justify the expensive monthly payments to himself and his family. This understanding completely undermined the narrative Michael had constructed about his real estate investment strategy and his progress toward building wealth through property ownership. Instead of being on a path toward owning luxury real estate in an exclusive neighborhood, he was simply a high-end renter whose housing costs were consuming an increasing percentage of his income while providing no ownership benefits or equity-building opportunity. The lifestyle he had been showcasing to family and friends was entirely dependent on his continued employment and his landlord's willingness to renew his lease at terms he could afford. The week leading up to his meeting with Thompson Property Solutions became an exercise in cognitive dissonance as Michael tried to reconcile his expertise in real estate markets with his growing realization that he had been naive about his own housing situation. He understood market appreciation, property values, and investment strategies in theoretical terms, but he had failed to apply that knowledge to evaluating his own lease agreement and long-term housing strategy. He had been so focused on the lifestyle benefits of living in Cascade Hills that he had ignored the financial implications of being a tenant rather than an owner. The most disturbing aspect of Michael's research was his discovery that Thompson Property Solutions specialized in exactly the kind of luxury rental arrangements that he had entered in. The company's marketing materials described a business model focused on on providing high-end temporary housing for executives, international clients, and other professionals who needed luxury accommodations without ownership commitment. Michael wasn't a potential homeowner who was testing life in an expensive neighborhood. He was a target market demographic for a sophisticated rental business that had identified his needs and financial capacity perfectly. The meeting he had requested to discuss lease modifications was actually a standard business consultation that Thompson Property Solutions probably conducted regularly with tenants who were experiencing sticker shock about rental increases in expensive markets. His excellent tenant history and property maintenance record were valuable, but they were valuable in the context of retaining a good customer for a profitable business operation, not in the context of personal relationships that would motivate special consideration or preferential treatment. By the time Thursday afternoon arrived, Michael had transformed from a confident tenant who expected to negotiate favorable lease terms based on his track record into an anxious renter who was beginning to understand that he had much less leverage in his housing situation than he had assumed. He was still planning to attend the meeting and advocate for terms that would make his continued tenancy more affordable and predictable, but he was no longer confident that his arguments would be persuasive to professional investors who evaluated everything based on market conditions and portfolio performance. What Michael couldn't have anticipated was that his meeting with Thompson Property Solutions would reveal that his assumptions about anonymous corporate landlords were as wrong as his assumptions about his negotiating position. The professional investors who controlled his housing situation weren't strangers who would evaluate his case based purely on business consideration. They were family members who had been watching his journey from confident real estate expert to increasingly desperate tenant with growing satisfaction. The systematic challenge to Michael's assumptions about his real estate success was about to become personal in ways that would force him to confront not just his housing situation, but his entire understanding of wealth building, property ownership, and his relationship with the sister he had been patronizing about financial responsibility for years. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.